Welcome to episode 4 of DDK Talks Esports. Today's guest is Rapha of Team Liquid. Rapha is the greatest Quakelive dueler of all time. The only person that's really in the discussion up there with him is Cypher, but I tend to lean towards Rapha. But before we get more into that and the details of who he is and why he's so suitable for this episode, I'd like to give you some updates as to how things are going with the podcast. Now, some of you may have noticed that I had some distribution woes to begin with and was switching services. I finally landed on what will be the final service and is likely maybe the best service for podcasting, which is Libsyn. And so right now you should be able to receive this podcast on pretty much any platform you desire. It should be available on iTunes for iOS, on pretty much any Android app, on YouTube as well, and it will soon be on Spotify. Now, if you're in a situation where you want to listen to the podcast and it's not on your app of choice, please tweet me at DDK Esports to let me know, and I'll try to investigate and fix that for you. As far as any other updates to the podcast go, I'm just gonna keep churning away. One a week is the goal, and one a week so far has been successful. And I've invested in now a bunch of audio equipment, which was not too cheap, unfortunately, but it will provide a very close to sort of home studio listening experience, as the equipment should be quite good. It's a couple of short SM58 microphones if you're into audio, and an H6 Zoom audio recorder and all the bits and bobs that go with that. So that's been one of my missions and aims with the podcast, is to be able to deliver at events podcasts. And on that note of at event podcasts, if you have any suggestions for topics and individuals that I should go out there and find at these events to sit down and talk to, please let me know at DDK Esports on Twitter again. I'm very, very open to suggestions and ideas from the kinds of content that you guys want. Now, finally, I have a Patreon, which if you choose to, if you're enjoying the podcast and you want to find a way to support me, at the moment, that's the best way to do it. And that is patreon.com/DDK Esports. Now, with all of that out the way, the housekeeping is done. Let's start talking a little bit more again about who Rapha is exactly, because I know that for a lot of you, you may not have any awareness as to what the history was really like in Quakelive. And there's a lot of people these days that don't even know what Quake is. And so for those people, I'll quickly say that you should go Google it. Google Quake 3. You could even type in Quake 3 or Quakelive and then Rapha's name. But ultimately, Quake 3 is an arena first-person shooting game. Very fast decision-making. Very low, in fact, no variance within the game itself except for spawns, and those are somewhat predictable. So all of the variance actually comes from the individual itself. And so this makes it very fascinating at the very top level. And it really makes Rapha very suitable to speak to, because Rapha is somebody that with consistency was able to dominate in the number one spot. And he did so with having an amazing approach from a mental perspective to his methodologies for practice and preparedness, to the way that he handled his own sort of mindset and, how he handled pressure and how he was able to consistently deliver his best performances whilst he was on the grand final stages to win titles. So this podcast will be an investigation into exactly how he was able to do that and how he looks at the game and how he looks at being a professional and what the future looks like for him as well. First of all, Rapha, thank you for joining me. But you're not a Counter-Strike person, so quite a lot of people won't know you, so hopefully my intro was handy. But yeah, I think there's a lot of topics that you uniquely can shed some light on, so really excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, it's always good to catch up with you. Don't get to see it at many events anymore, so it's good to take the opportunity to do this.
Yeah. I think it's really strange too, because there is definitely a handful of people these days that sort of are aware that I kind of came from the Quake background, from a playing perspective as well as a commentary perspective and stuff. So it's, I guess this will be really nice for those people who know the Quake scene, but I think for the rest, there's a lot of juicy stuff here. So, right, we'll dive into it. So obviously in the introduction, I mentioned sort of your history and how illustrious it is and how much sort of championship level experience you have as an individual. But I'm kind of curious where it all started for you from the perspective of getting good quickly, and if there's anything before esports, like, where you were very competitive, like prior to esports.
I'd say growing up, a good competitive outlet for me was basketball. I loved playing basketball growing up. Um, it's something that I thoroughly enjoyed, and I think that sports itself, whether it's what I did most is I played basketball and I also ran cross country a bit. I was never like um, super elite at either, but I was pretty decent. And I think like the team aspect from basketball and how situations need to be approached and how you improve compared to the individual aspect of running and what type of grind those two are and how they're different, but they've both kind of melded together for me into Quake. I think really helped me with how to properly approach um, practice and overall improvement in general.
So, what was it really about Quake, per se, that sort of struck your interest? And when did you actually start playing first? Like what was the time frame between you starting Quake as well and actually becoming competitive?
Yeah, well, I remember I was like, shoot, how old was I, man? I must have been like 11 or 12, something like that. And my dad had started playing Quake too. Like back then, he like self-taught himself how to uh, build his own computer. He was trying to like save money, but also like get into like how computers work and all that stuff. And he loved games, and he realized like how much potential you could get from the internet and playing with people, from all around the world. And that's something that intrigued him. And he fell in love with Quake 2. And I didn't play much of Quake 2 because when I did visit him, he was on the computer most of the time. But I did get a taste for it, and I really enjoyed it. But Quake 3 is when I really started to get involved with multiplayer gaming and just what Quake was. And I think what I fell in love with the most was my dad went to QuakeCon in 2001, and he came back and he showed me that, at the time he didn't even know until he went to QuakeCon that there was actual like circuit, of big tournaments with big prize money back then for people all around the world competing for that to be the best. And once he showed me like the demo recordings of those players, and I could see like from my own perspective and like how good my dad was at the time, like our skill, like comparative to theirs, I just fell in love with it. I just knew that the competitive drive that I got out of sports and what I enjoyed with Quake, I could get to an even greater extent for myself. And yeah, I fell in love with Duel back then, even when I was 13 years old. And yeah, I've been with it ever since. I didn't really get to play too much until I was probably like 18, 19. I didn't have an internet connection of my own. Like that's when I finally started to get to play really consistently. But up from like 13 to 18, I only got to play Quake, like actual like decent games online, maybe 4 to 6 weeks total time out of the year. Otherwise, I was just a young kid in the shadows who really didn't get an opportunity to shine until I was like, yeah, 18 or 19.
And how old are you now, just for frame of reference?
I'm 29. It's been a long fucking time. Yeah.
That is really interesting because I kind of I definitely feel you a bit with the story. Sort of just how for me as well, like video games and competition, and just sort of like the meeting of those two, the marriage of those two passions, and also just having Quake taken away from you at some point and not being able to really compete. It was like kind of similar for me. I actually had to like I played Quake 3 demo in like end of '99, beginning of 2000. And I got very, very good very quickly because I was so addicted to being the best on the server. And then the real game released, and I couldn't get my hands on it because my mum wouldn't buy it for me because it was 18 rated, and I was like 12 or something. So I had a hiatus for like 2 or 3 years until I could finally get my hands on it too. So I feel you're there. Although I didn't rise to quite the heights of success that you did. So from the age of 18, when you really started getting involved, seriously, like what was your trajectory like? How was your initial competitive experience, and how quickly or how slowly in your eyes did it take you until you reached what would be seen as a professional competitive level?
Yeah. I'd say even like just before I was out of high school, there was like a year or two. I remember specifically 2005 because I remember watching the ESWC finals between CCM and Cooler Live. At the time, I happened to be visiting my dad during that time period, and I would say over the year before that, I was somehow in between the long gaps of not playing, when I would come back, I would actually be improving. Something that I would do at home, like I had a computer at home, I just had my internet wasn't even 56K, it was like 26K. And the only thing I would do sometimes is download demos from ESR of like tournament stuff, and every now and then, amidst hanging out with friends and dealing with school and work and stuff, I would watch demos of myself and the pros and try to like just compare and contrast like what I do better than them and what they definitely do better than me, and how I can try to like meld all that together and really improve my game and work on my fundamentals and then reach out from there. And yeah, I went to CPL 2006 and I got top 12, and I beat a couple pretty decent players at the time, and I had a very close set with Zamus in the upper bracket final. And not the upper bracket final, but in the upper bracket.
Just quickly, to interrupt you, sorry to interrupt you. For frame of reference, for those of you that don't know Zamus, he, at the time that Rapha's speaking of, he was effectively a top 4 player in Sweden, jeweler in Sweden, I think many would consider, and perhaps at the time people considered him to have the best mechanics, and he was a very consistent powerhouse of jewels, so that was quite an achievement. That's
yeah, and I lost to him, and then I beat, at the time, who was very, very good in Quake 4. I beat Lost Cause during that tournament, and that's how I moved into the top 12. And then I also played some practice games with CZM, and I did very well on a few maps. I think I might have won No DM9 against him in practice, which was Lost World, if you want to like convert that for everybody else. But the rest of the maps I lost in practice. But it showed me like that I was really improving and that I wasn't that far off from being at the level that I needed to be. And I think the next step from that was Quake 4 ended up being the main game for a while, right? Like 06 and 07. And right out of high school, I started trying to play in the tournaments in NA that I could for WSVG, which was for Quake 4. I'd finally gotten my computer upgraded to where I could run the game enough to be able to play it. And I had my own internet connection. And I didn't do particularly well as far as placements are concerned, but the amount of time that I spent in Quake 4 that summer, and the learning process that I gained from having to, because even though the Quakes, they're pretty similar, there are big differences in like the style and speed that you need to approach the game. And I think what it really helped me with is how to properly learn a game and new situations on my own, like being started, fresh again, and how to actually approach it, and the grind of being beaten over and over, but being positive about it, and what can I take from those losses and to improve my own game. And when ESWC announced they were picking up Quake 3 again in 2008, everything just started kind of like molding together for me. The experience that I had with Quake 4 and then coming back to the game that I loved in Quake 3, I started to see vast improvements in my game, becoming more and more consistent. And that's the era also where 04, he came back. He was very, very famous in Quake 3. He had taken some time off for college, and he had never heard of me before. He hadn't seen me, and he noticed my skill. And his words to me were either you're a cheater or you're going to place top 3 at the finals this year. And he wanted to help me out in terms of mentoring me in, actual LAN tournament mindset and trying to prepare me to become a more consistent player in the future. I think he saw like his younger self within, my play, and he just wanted to be able to kind of give over what was taught to him by like Machiavelli, and then from Machiavelli was Thresh, kind of like handing down a bit of those, hints and advice onto the next, I guess you could say, generation in terms of Quake.
Yeah, there's a very one of my favorite quotes is from Isaac Newton, and it was if I seem further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. So kind of a little nod to that, perhaps. Going back a little bit to that moment when you felt as though, hang on, I'm actually not that far away from the very top flight competition here. What was sort of like in your head at that time period? What was it in particular that you thought that you had to change or improve, or what were you weak at that you felt like if I just improve this or these things, I'll make that jump and I'll be a world title contender?
I think what 04 helped me with a lot is because I had a lot of good raw skill. I had a very good talent for reading players and patterns, and I timed really well. But my problem was is sometimes in his terms I would get too cute, which means that I would make sometimes hard reads to where it's like if it works out, it's amazing, right? But I'm not always leaving myself an escape route to where like it's a bunch of traps that are all ins, and trying to view and look at situations like what are the actual percentages of them working out, positive expected value and negative expected value, and constantly judging and weighing those options for yourself. And so what he tried to do is help me with that mindset of and that approach. I applied it to understanding I needed to make my game more consistent. I needed to make my game more flexible in terms of creating advantages for myself, but also leaving an out in case the other player outplayed me, so that the duels became, instead of just like one or two instances in the game where it's like a major game breaking fight, I tried to split it up into multiple chances within the game and just created more opportunities for myself to succeed. And so just try to play very, very well off the fundamentals and then slowly branch out and do very unique things based off the information that, I get from playing my opponent throughout the game.
Man, I feel like there's just an enormous amount of topics there that are very specific about some of the nuances of actually how to duel at the top level, which I'd love to talk about. But trying to stay on topic, I'd like to. You mentioned that one of your sort of inherent strengths, latent strengths, is reading the players and reading patterns and so on. Do you think? Do you know where that comes from, or is that just something you just that's just something you take for granted about yourself?
I actually think so. I loved watching American football growing up, and my favorite player, the quarterback Peyton Manning. I realized and noticed like how much he actually valued, was it, like film study, like studying up on his opponents. And at the time, he was bringing to football something that hadn't been seen before from that level in terms of constantly changing the play at the line of scrimmage based off of the knowledge and reading how the defense is going to play out. So pretty much trying to be flexible and not just, trying to overpower another team, even though, like your play set up against theirs is bad, and like trying to pretty much like just hope and, rely on luck rather than, you're actually trying to play strategically and give yourself the advantage. And I tried to take that approach with Quake. I tried to really review my own games and be very critical for myself and like look at myself from an outside perspective. There's a problem with a lot of really good players in many sorts of FPS games is that they make excuses for themselves, and most of the time the excuse is, "Ah, man, if I only had just had better aim in the situation, I would have won it." Well, yeah, that could be said so many times, though. You need to try to break down these situations into what can you actually control. Like, is the situation that you're complaining about that you didn't aim well in, was it actually a good fight? Is it a fight that you're going to win, like 70 to 80% of the time? Is it a fight where you should aim very, very well and you just, miss some easy shots? Or is it one where it's like you were actually put into a difficult situation and the reason you lost is because you had to bail yourself out and you didn't? So I think it just comes down to being very honest with yourself. And the more honest you are, the more you'll see yourself improve. Because then you can actually break down why you're actually losing and how to try to change that.
Okay, so there you're basically you really reminded me of sort of my own revelations when it came to like what I had learned from diving into poker for a year and studying poker methodologies and psychology mindsets. Just like this outcome oriented behavior that's where people are sort of focused too much on things that they can't really control versus, again, like you used another term that's used frequently within poker but is applicable in everything, which is expected value. And that's effectively what you're talking about from like a play perspective, a playmaking perspective. And it's really interesting because the reason that I've come across that people think in this sort of suboptimal way is because they don't have a model, a structure, a way to basically think about the game. Because like the way that I usually describe this is that you have when you're playing any kind of a game, when you're in any situation in life, you're constantly being bombarded with data, and if you have a model that is specific to reaching a certain outcome, to then pass that data through, then now you can remove all the noise. You understand like how to think about something, and it allows you to actually really be a much better decision maker because it's very focused on the task at hand. And so my question following this to you is that obviously you have these models of thought, and this is something that when you're dueling, it allows you to tweak certain things when you're playing against certain players to kind of change your decision making trees based on the situation. How did you come across that at the beginning? Was it just watching demos consistently? Did you sort of construct things in a sort of backwards way? You'd watch the top players and then you'd be like, slowly constructing what you think is the correct theory of duel? Or how did you? Or is that still evolving? Is that something that would you say is fairly static? The principles of how you play duel correctly, or is it ever evolving? Did you strictly learn about it through watching demos and deconstructing them, or how was that process for you to create the models?
I think so, and this is just for Quake and specifically. I think for me, I realized early on when I was younger that Quake is, besides aim, the biggest factor in the game is your movement. Like whether that's dodging or actual like strafe jumping and yourself flowing throughout the map. And I approached it as in, if I get very good at movement, which allows me to create more opportunities for myself to cut people off, to get to the items faster, to create good positioning for myself, or to be able to escape. It also, what it does for me is, in my head, if I know how fast I can possibly go, then I also know how fast my opponent can get from A to B to C, whatever it is, which also leads to, me being able to predict in my mind correctly what situations I can actually go for and what situations I can't, because I know like certain opportunities are way too dangerous. Like it just creates more certainty in your mind to know like what all the options are for your opponent rather than leaving it to chance. And so I tried to get very good at the movement, because that's like the one thing that's not as natural with FPS is movement, whereas shooting comes naturally and you can work on that like as you keep playing. So for me, it came down to working on my movements, then aim came into part, and then what's also super important in Quake is item management. Like I think that's what makes Quake so amazing in Duel, is the fact that it's not just about shooting the other guy and like who hits more wins. It's not what it's about. It's about controlling the map, and the more stacked you are with health and armor, the more opportunities you have for engagements and to overpower your opponent, and how you need to play and be flexible around that. I think even in Quake Champions, that's pretty much the same. I think there are certain things that have changed with that, with the way that they've changed the dual format, but we can get into that later. But no, that's how I tried to approach the game, is like movement is super important to me, aim, and then obviously like, well, more so positioning and control, and then aim comes last. That's like the standard methodology. I try to make all my situations rely on like me just hitting averagely. Like if I can aim okay in this fight, can I win it? Like, and I try to like, let it be, if I aim really well or hit some sick shots, they're just a bonus for me. It's not like I'm relying on that to win. I try to rely on the fundamentals and then branching out from there based off of reading the opponent throughout the game.
And I think all the things you're saying as well are like very applicable to people who are not like, if you're playing like, let's say a game like Counter-Strike or something where you remove some of the items. I think all of the things that you're talking about here is still very applicable, because it's all about what you can control versus what you can't control. Ultimately, making the best decision on those things. And to move it forwards slightly. Obviously, one of the things that I've always found very fascinating about Quake is that it's very, very fast paced. There's, especially in Duel, even though there's some quieter moments in Duel where players are walking around and so on. It always felt to me like you don't really get a chance. It's very hard to sort of catch yourself making a mistake and autocorrect, because the first instinct needs to be the right choice. Often in Quake Duel, I found that situation cropped up a lot. So it becomes a lot about habituating certain good practices and thinking patterns and so on when you're playing. Did you ever have any like, do you have any thoughts on this idea? And did you ever have any sort of niggly problems in your game where you would watch a demo and see a repeated mistake, and you would find it hard to habituate the resolution?
I think. I think the biggest factor is like trying to, for me, was when playing the game. It's like just once you start to understand that when you look at other players and you're looking at yourself, what I noticed the most is sometimes people would fight for items and have even fights that they don't need to take. So, like, for example, if both players are in the middle of the game, it's pretty even, and you're 150 for each player, and you're fighting over this item. I felt like a lot of players, including myself, would want to fight for that item and believe that, okay, you're thinking about the positives that come out of the situation. You're thinking about, okay, we're even, I get the jump on this fight, I win it, all this good stuff will happen for me. But I had to start reminding myself and just like, making it a habit to constantly think about, okay, unless this is a really decent chance for me to win this situation, or like if it doesn't go well within the first few seconds, I need to back out and create another situation, in, let's say, like 15 to 30 seconds. Just constantly keep trying to imagine what can happen in the future. And even though it does kind of like, you want to have confidence in yourself, but I've always tried to take the humble approach of realizing, what if it doesn't work out, and am I willing to live with that consequence? And it's something that did take a little while, but the more and more you force yourself to play that way, I think, it ultimately leads, to the best consistent play. And then you could start like melding it all together. And it's not so much about playing defensive, it's about like just aggressively creating multiple mini opportunities rather than big all-in fights, I'd say. That was like probably the biggest struggle for me. But it's proved to be my greatest strength because I stuck with it.
Turning the weakness into a strength. I like to hear it. It's also really cool in a way for me because I always had this sort of this phrase that I inherited from one of my mentors a long time ago, which was, when you're ahead or have an advantage, you should always be thinking about what is the one like most likely way for me to lose the advantage, or for me to come off worse in this situation somehow. Like, what is the one thing that can go wrong? And so I like it that it's sort of the application of that, but in more scenarios. And what I also like, and I think is very smart, and as you I think the proof is in the pudding, as it were, with your results. That approach is really cool because I always another thing I try to describe to people in commentary when I'm talking about decision making at the professional level is that you have to sort of assume that everyone has very good fundamentals, and so ultimately it should come down to decision making if we're looking at it from two players getting a bunch of different chances to make various plays, and they're going to always try to pick the highest percentage plays for themselves, and then over time you should come out on top if you're the smarter player. And so if you are the smarter player and you can create like way more instances where decisions have to be made by both players, yourself and them, I feel like over you should much more on average be more consistent in coming out on top as a more intelligent player. So I like this idea of trying to create as many decisions as possible in the match if that's the strength of that you have as a player. But speaking of which, in Quake, one thing I wanted to address, because again, this is something that I think is experienced in CS as well. I think most of the listeners will be from the CS world, and it's you have this there's always been this excuse in the North American region in CS. It's less to these of a less extent these days, but it's about not having the greatest practice pool, not having all the best players in your region in comparison with Europe, which typically in CS and Quake always had a stronger professional scene from a practice perspective. Was this ever an issue for you? Do you have any ways to mitigate it or any workarounds? Because obviously you're still able to get results regardless.
That's a really good question, actually. I think I just tried to make the most of what I had available, because it definitely is true. Even in Quake, the EU scene overall, the greater median of skill is much larger over in Europe than it is here in North America. And I think what helped me a lot is just being willing to study my opponents and myself compared to like the average that other players do, And as well, I tried to, when I would play high-level players in NA, like around my skill level, pretty often, but other times I would play like lesser skilled players as well. And if I would play them on their best maps, and so that they would have a better chance of beating me. And what I would do is I would set up mini goals for myself within those games. I would set up like, okay, I want to work on this game, on this map specifically on how do I play without using railgun very much. Like, let's say like I'm actually being locked out of the weapon for most of the game. How do I overcome this and try to win regardless? So I would set a limit for myself, like, okay, throughout this 10-minute duel, I can only fire 5 rail shots, no matter what. If I'm behind, I have to figure out a way to chase the guy down without using railgun or to cut him off and things like that. Or I would set up, like, let's see here, on a blood run, for example. There were times where I would really want to work on, fighting around the red armor. So I would be like, okay, I can only control Mega and the yellows. I can never pick up the red unless it's absolutely uncontested. So I will just set up and try to make sure I get kills and fights and design around how to fight around red armor. And then other games, I would flip it to the opposite. I can only get the armors. I can't get the Mega. I could just deal damage or just concede it and find out how to take advantage of him after the fact, like cutting people off 5 to 10 seconds after the item when they're not expecting it, things like that, and just evolving my game and trying to practice and set up different scenarios and creating mini handicaps in a sense for myself. And the other thing is always taking the practice seriously. When I've always looked at it as quality of practice over quantity, because I'm not a person that likes to sit there and practice like all the time. I get pretty burnt out. So I try to take advantage of the hour to 2 hours that I sit down and play very seriously, regardless of the level of the opponent, because I want to play it as high a level as I can and get the most out of it before I start going through the motions. And once I would start going through the motions, like that's my last game. I don't play anymore. It's over. I don't gain anything from it. I'll just start creating bad habits for myself. And so, yeah, I think it's just the way that I approached how serious that I took practice when I did, and being willing to look and see how other players approach the game and try to like theorize how I would try to counter what they're doing and put it into practice.
Yeah, effectively like supplementing the training in a sense, picking out the specific areas to work on. I think that's like that is usually at the top of my list of like advice to give people on practice. But there is one issue with it, which I'll pose to you now. Like in this example, you're saying, okay, I'm treating practice as practice. I don't care about the outcome. I care about specifically working on these scenarios, so I have more concentrated experience on these things, and then later on I can bring that experience into the full sort of 100% duel when I'm in a competition. However, if with this approach, you sort of your mechanics might suffer as a result, because I think mechanics that you can do some sort of focus training, but it seems, I mean, disagree with me if you think if this is not the case, but it feels like it really does help to have a huge amount of, let's say, hours in dumb practice and grind, let's say, to improve your mechanics. So how did you separate between practice, supplementing for decision making as you were describing, and making sure your mechanics are as good as people, or as good as they can be, when you're playing people like Evil and Cypher and Toxic, people who have incredible aim?
I would say back then, during that tournament era, what I would do is just between big tournaments is I would play like here and there during the weeks, like maybe a couple hours. Most nights I'd just play 1 to 2 hours, and sometimes I'd take breaks off. But like once it got closer and closer to tournament, it's all about like ramping up to your peak performance and making sure you're not burnt out. So like let's say a month out from a tournament, I'll start practicing 2 hours a night for like five nights a week. And 3 weeks out, it becomes like 2 hours plus VOD reviewing, because now I have sample data, right? Then it becomes 2 weeks out, you're starting to pick up 4 hours a day, maybe even 6 for myself, like leading up right up to the tournament and getting your peak performance. So at that point, like you're playing quite a bit. So I feel like you have the best judge of yourself of where your aim is, where your aim, movement, all that stuff, you could come where it comes together and you can figure out how you want to approach the game in terms of how aggressive you want to be, how defensive you want to play, how flexible you can be. And then, especially for me, because I actually have a very good overall like game in terms of mechanics in Quake, but I don't super excel at anything, if that makes sense, compared to the other players in the scene. Like a good example is Cypher's LG and railgun aim is just insane, and he has amazing rockets, but they're in such a different fighting style than other players. Whereas a player like Strengths or Toxic, their LG is what they're known for. They're tracking an LG aim, and so a player like Kilson he's a player where I never want to get in rail fights with Kilson. The only time I ever want to get in rail fights with him is where I can afford to go 2-for-1, in the sense that he can hit 2 rails to my 1 and I still come out in the advantage based off of stack and positioning. You know, it's just constantly bringing together what your own skill set is in the game and judging it towards other players and playing around your strengths and their weaknesses and vice versa, and making sure that you're not feeding into their play style, that you're not giving them what they want constantly. That's what I felt like some players at the top level made mistakes in, is that they would be playing too many fights into the advantage of the other player's strengths. And I tried to play each opponent differently. I had like my fundamental set for how I wanted to play a map, but then that's where I would always like alter it based off my opponent, and either play aggressively in situations I wouldn't against other players because I can tell that they don't handle like mid-range fights very well, or they are very weak against up-close rocket fights. So I constantly want to be cutting them off and creating situations like that. So I think that's just how it all went for me. It's like you ramp up your skill and your mechanics go along with it, like right before a tournament, and then it just all comes together, and you're playing in the moment and constantly reading and reacting based off of what the work that you've put in.
I really like that point as well, because I used to try to, like, towards the end, I used to try to really focus on that, like thinking, what is my opponent's strength? Because usually your opponents will model their game around their strengths. And so if you can deny them those situations where they get to leverage that strength, it creates a lot of discomfort for them. And all of a sudden, they can't play like they do in practice as well. Because it's kind of rare, I think, to get opponents that will know you that well and then know how to play a good duel whilst still applying that principle of keeping your opponent out of their strengths area. I remember having an experience like that against Strengths, because Strengths was perhaps one of the most one-dimensional of the professional duelers. I remember like playing him on Aerial Walk, and I said to myself, I'm just not gonna take any fights against him. And it's really funny because he ended up getting very frustrated, and I ended up beating him multiple times, and he got very, very pissed off. So I was very satisfied with that. But but it was such a perfect example of that very principle, and it's very satisfying to sort of outplay someone in that respect. But like when you like going back to the beginning of your answer, you were talking about addressing sort of the ideas of getting your mechanics in a good stead, and you stated I would ramp myself up and ramp the practice up to get myself into that tournament ready form. Did you ever have any situations whereby, again, in Quake, we don't have really as many tournaments, circuits, and as frequent lands as you would have in in the modern era of esports now, with a game like Counter-Strike, which is oversaturated with tournaments. So in reality, sometimes the easiest way to get confidence and to judge your own performance was via your practice games. So it's almost like this paradox there, because you want to have good quality practice in which you're practicing and not caring about winning, but then at the same time, like, did you ever have issues with that? Like, the week leading up to tournaments, you're actually like not losing, you're not winning very much in practice, and even though you kind of don't care about it, maybe you kind of do. And does it affect your confidence? Like, what did you ever have any issues around that?
I actually, like, normally leading up to tournaments, my win percentage in practice was actually very good. So I wouldn't say that I would have that much of an issue in terms of that respect. The one thing I would have is every now and then I would have an online tournament where I would maybe lose to, let's say, Dang, or I lost once or twice to 0-4 before a QuakeCon or whatever, like leading up to it. Or like I'd be in Europe and playing in what were the cups back then? They were like Zotac cups, or like I can't remember what the other one was. But it's like just judging how I'm trying to approach the game as if it's LAN, and just seeing how all the other players are playing, and what their shape is. And sometimes I could just tell, like even in a loss online, I could tell that, okay, what I'm doing, how I'm approaching these fights, like I actually did do what I was supposed to do. It just, this time, it like the lower percentage chances of it working out, it worked out for them. And as long as I keep applying the right mindset and stay positive and just keep focusing on what I should be doing in terms of land play, I'll be fine. Because something that happened for years is I remember, you remember when like all the tournaments were shifting from having CRTs to LCDs,
Yep.
and the huge difference in performance that was back then. And for a long time, I had a 75 hertz LCD monitor, and even when monitors started to get to the point where they were actually like very good with the 120 hertz, 144 hertz, I hadn't upgraded my monitor at the time. So I'm playing on this like delayed monitor compared to everybody else. So their game is running smoother. They're playing better. And in a sense, I'm almost handicapping myself back then in terms of practicing online. And so then when I would get to these events that have 144 hertz monitors compared to what I'm playing at home, dude, it felt so smooth. And so my game felt like it just totally opened up, and I could be more aggressive and more assertive. I could like be more sure in the situations that I'm creating for myself. I don't think that so much happens today because I'm playing like on the pretty much the same hardware that's at tournaments now. But I think that's something that actually helped me back then. Is I was playing in worse conditions at home, but then when I went to LAN, everything felt better. So it just made me that much more confident in my play, and yeah, it helped out a lot, I think.
It's quite funny actually. It reminds me of I think in like 2003 or something, I tried this trick when I just came back to Quake 3, where I would watch demos in a greatly reduced time scale, like, you know, 0.3 time scale. So that'd be, you know, watching a demo, you know, 30% speed. And I would watch the demo for like 20 minutes or something like that. And then I would go into a game, and my lightning gun I would like add like 20% hit rate to my lightning gun and my railgun and everything, because it looked like everything was moving in slow motion. So I guess that's like a similar effect that you had. Moving forwards in the discussion, we've been talking sort of a lot about, you know, preparing for tournaments and sort of, you know, everything around that. But when it comes to actually stepping into like onto the stage and so on, do you have anything that you're thinking about when it comes to the methodology of playing like on stage matches? You know, do you have any sort of pre-match rituals? How do you make sure that when you sit down, you're going to play a lights out game?
I think this is the biggest aspect that I think 04 helped me with. Is realizing that when you're playing these high level matches, that it's all on the line, that, you know, this is your one and only opportunity to win this game. You will never get it back. And that's really how I look at it. And also, one thing he tried to remind me of is how you played in practice. The highest level that you played in practice, you probably won't be playing at in your match. You can't rely on the best that you've played in practice as to what your standard will be. You have to think about that you'll play just a bit worse than that, and how would you approach the game from there. And then if you're playing well, it just sort of like feeds on itself in the game. You know, like you're not relying on yourself to play at your best. You're relying on like what you can do while playing as consistent as possible, you know. So going into a big game, I just try to, you know, just take a deep breath. I just try to like remind myself, just stay focused in the moment. Don't think about things that don't matter. Like, don't, just do everything you can not to lose. Look at it as if I've already won. What do I do to not lose this game? So I just do everything I can to stay in the moment, stay focused on everything that's important within the game, and just lay it all on the line and don't leave any excuses. And I think that's helped me a lot, because I know, like, once I'm in that final against Cooler, against Cypher, against DeHang, against whoever, like, that's the only time I'm going to get to play it. I'll never get another chance, and I want to make the most of it.
So that's a really interesting way to phrase that right at the end there, because one of the things that's okay, so one of the biggest dynamics with these performances is pressure, and, you know, you're talking about essentially, you know, mindfulness and, you know, the ability to like mentally reset and so on. If you make a mistake, not to immediately bring into your minds like all of the repercussions from this mistake? Oh, now I'm in a worse position. Now this could threaten my chances to win this match. Oh, this is really important to me. Oh, everyone just saw me mess that up. And then the pressure starts to mount on yourself. So as far as mindfulness practices and like the ability for a mental reset and so on, how do you, like, what is your entire approach with that specifically? Because that to me ties into dealing with pressure. Because everyone is experiencing pressure, just some people have different mechanisms to process it, which allows them to perform and for it not to impact their performance. So how do you view this specifically?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something I've thought about a lot too. Watching other players over the years and how they deal with it as well. And I think just in the moment in the game, like you were saying, the good thing that you brought up is what a lot of people probably think. They're thinking, "Oh my God, I just made such a terrible mistake. Like, how many people just saw me do that? I look like an idiot." Like you can't be saying these things to yourself in that moment. The only thought that should matter is your own thought. Like just be completely zoned into the game and what matters. And when anything goes wrong, you need to be problem solving, not dwelling on what happened. The only thought that you should have on what happened is, how do I make sure it doesn't happen again? Not like letting it snowball into your mind and you get angrier and angrier about some situation that is already in the past. You can't hit rewind, you can't pause and go back there and change it. You can just deal with what's in the present. And I think that like sometimes like I'm so in the moment at tournaments nowadays, like I don't even really like, I know there's been like some tournament wins that I have where I don't look really excited or whatever. It's like it doesn't really hit me until like a day or two after that, wow, I actually won, and like all the feelings of what comes out of that, or even like after a defeat, that doesn't really happen for me until a little while after, as I try to just focus so much on being in the present moment. And I think that's something a lot of people struggle with, is just realizing that what other people think doesn't matter. Just do everything that you can to try to win. And it's something that's gotten easier for me over the years, but I definitely had like, I had to work through that grind of working through like playing with nerves and when your hand's shaking, and how do you, deal with that and just keep trying to play at your best level. And yeah, I think most of it is like, don't be too hard on yourself. Like everybody goes through it, and you just have to like take it one step at a time and just try to look at it in small little steps rather than letting it be an overwhelming big picture type thing that you can't handle. So, yeah.
It's interesting because I recall instances myself, and I tried to, like, once I realized I was doing it, I tried to get good at sort of being aware. And I think that sort of awareness is, and sort of the clarity of how you see your own thoughts as they happen is really critical here, because as you're saying, like over time, like you're going through tournaments, you're getting experience, and you're very, I would imagine from what it sounds like, you're very quick to understand exactly how you're thinking and feeling, and whether or not like there is a better way to to think about this thing that just happened to get you closer to the win. And that's kind of, as you say, like don't think about, obviously your mindset should be in a mode in which nothing is a barrier to success and nothing creates like resistance to that success. But one thing I would love to know if you've experienced this as well. There's been a lot of times in the past, and sometimes now because I don't play as much, I experience it again, where I'll have like a play set up in my mind and I'll go for it. Then something changes, like the equation changes, but I still commit to the play anyway because I felt like it was a really good play, and I generated like a mini emotional attachment to the play. And so I still do it, even though I know I shouldn't be doing it, because I can't just be in the moment. I can't just be of the mind. I just need to make the best decision at every single moment, and keep refreshing that as the moments change.
Yeah, you got to realize like you're not just like playing against some objective. You're playing against another player who, it's like a battle of wills, and you have to accept that sometimes you're going to be pushed back. I've definitely had some of those moments myself. Like it's a strong emotional response, a strong emotional play, which is very, very bad to get into the habit of doing. And I think that some players really struggle with that. I think a player that I've seen who, and I think you'd probably agree with this, like a player who could have probably been at the top if they got rid of this problem was
Fox?
Sparty.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I would say Sparty, actually.
Okay.
Well, I mean, Fox as well. But I think the way that they emotionally responded to things like that was different. Where I think Sparty, in the sense, it was more, sometimes he would feed some kills like off of spawn to make up for something that happened, whereas Fox would kind of mentally shut down, and you could tell he wouldn't focus as much uh, over like a period of 2 minutes, and then he'd recollect himself and be like, okay, what the hell am I doing? Like, get back into the game. And yeah, it's something that I think holds some players who are like just under, let's say, the top 8 from being at like top 4 material, is allowing their emotions to get the best of them and not channeling that into something positive for themselves.
So, what is the solution for people like that, for the professionals and the non-professionals alike? Is it just about having that clarity of mind, being able to sort of check your thoughts and be like, okay, how am I thinking? Okay, I'm thinking emotionally. Okay, why am I thinking emotionally? And then sort of, is it just like that process of just like isolating all like everything that's happening in your mind and then sort of figuring out how to sort of reprogram it? Or what would be your advice to people who are experiencing issues with their emotions impacting their performance?
This, this is gonna sound kind of this is weird. It's kind of contradictory, but it's it's how I've tried to approach the game, and I think it's helped me a lot. I feel like I have a very humble um, view on where my skill set is compared to everybody else. I actually view the other players extremely highly in what they bring to the game, and I have a lot of respect for what they do. But at the same, but in that same sense, I have the belief in myself that I am going to be the one that wins. It's like this driven goal of, at the end of this game, I will be the better player and I will win, regardless of how good they are. It's just I don't get to the point where like I'm overconfident in the sense that I can just disregard what they are, you know. It's like combining like the belief that you're doing everything that you can within the game to be the person that wins, while playing around how good the other competition is. Um, so it has to do with ego. It really does. It has to do with, at the end of the day, if something does really go wrong or some other player pulls off something amazing, like just like tip your hat to him and just move on with your life. Move on with the next situation instead of like reliving that moment in your mind, you know. At this, because if you keep reliving that moment, you give them more power and control over you, in a sense, mentally. Like, you're letting them get in your head and they're like playing clear and focused, and you're the one that's like got cloudy vision and you're not thinking properly and playing efficiently. So you need to like focus on, in that present moment, what can you do to win and problem solve. It's like giving yourself the best chance to win. So yeah, it's like it's a battle of balancing your ego versus, and realizing that um that it's not always going to go your way, but do everything you can to make it go your way, and just roll with the punches.
So we may end up extending this podcast slightly because there's a lot of like really interesting stuff that I just want to talk to you about. But
Yeah, it's no problem.
On this point, so there's two things in particular there that I think are really interesting contradictions. As you said, it was contradictory in nature. So the first thing is, so you talked about it. You create this reality where you're playing in the moment, but what you're also doing, what you just described as a contradiction, is you're setting up the expectation that you're walking out with the win. And so, like, from what I've come to understand is, setting up expectations can be problematic. But I think there is, and I think, like, I really understand where you're coming from with this contradiction. I've always believed in the idea that the mind is a very powerful thing, and we can live under very positive self-delusions. For example, I would describe this to be, whenever you're on the server, your belief, like when you're playing competition, your belief can only be that you're the best on the server. Otherwise, what is the point in playing? Obviously, from an objective, rational standpoint, that's not true. That's not necessarily the truth. And you could go into all kinds of different discussions and metrics as to how you would quantify that. But that's like the belief that you have to hold. And at the same time, you've got to be in the moment. And at the same time, you've got to be divorced from outcomes so that your emotions don't get in a position where it can be hindersome. So, is this the same kind of like thought process that you came upon? Like, Do you agree with like the idea of like self delusions and so on, and these sort of finer psychological points?
Yeah, I agree. I think I hit on it like earlier with the whole, when you're reviewing your own games, like, and the common theme of people saying they're deluding themselves into thinking that, if only I just aimed better in this situation, instead of like actually breaking it down to the real reasoning and steps beforehand that led to that situation in the first place. Uh, it's something that actually I really thank Carmack a lot from ESL. Um, he what was it before the first IEM that I won? He noticed that I was like um, I was kind of acting and talking like that in a sense about myself sometimes, and so he had me watch the movie The Hustler, which is an old movie about pretty much pool hall junkies and hustlers. And there's a line in there, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but the the sport at which everybody is the greatest athlete in the world is feeling sorry for yourself. And then, like, when I watched that and like heard that, it like really hit home that the people that don't allow that to happen and like feel sorry for themselves and constantly like pity and woe is me, like, are the ones that actually like go and get what they want. Like, they don't just sit there and dwell on that constantly. They are continually striving to go after their goal and to do what it takes to make it happen. And that really hit home for me before that tournament, and I think it really, really helped, in leading to winning that IEM. Like, I literally had to play Avec, Cypher, Cooler, and Dehang all in the same tournament. Like,
Jesus,
I know. It's,
the hardest run possible.
yeah, it's ridiculous. And if it wasn't for me, like, having that mindset of just not creating those kind of excuses for myself and just completely committing into the moment of the game and visualizing my success and how do I make it happen, I don't think I would have won. And it also comes down to 0-4 broke it down to me in the sense of you don't play to win, you play to not lose. People that play to win take unnecessary risks, right? It's like that situation where I said, like, a lot of players take the mindset of, if I win this fight and it works out for me, I get all of these good things that happen, but they don't think of the bad, right? It's about approaching the game in, I've already won. So how do I make sure, like, this one scenario that can happen that I can lose, okay, I do everything I can to avoid that. I create all these other situations so that that doesn't happen. Like you said, you were reminding yourself, like, when you were in the lead, what's the one thing that this player can do that will ultimately lead to them coming back? So you play around, I've already won, how do I keep it that way? That's how I've approached it for years, and that's not going to change. So,
That's really interesting because of a few things. One, that reminds me of Cooler's playstyle sometimes. I used to really like watching Cooler play because I would always be really impressed by how he always seemed so comfortable and confident, much more so than pretty much anyone else that I'd watched, playing with a one frag lead. As though the game was won sometimes. Like, if he has a one frag lead, he's like was always just so confident that he's like he can just hold that by outsmarting his opponent and just playing the map out. Just being so comfortable with no margin for error I was always found it very impressive. Everyone else is always like their mindset in that position is, I have to get more frags, but this is now my time to exert the any sort of leverage I have on the map, the greater leverage that I have compared with my opponent on the map, to get more frags, to give myself more security for this win, which actually can in of itself be a bad way of thinking about it, as you say. And the really interesting thing that you just said, I think that a lot of people will be like, hang on, like, what did he just say? I need to listen to that again. Is that, the play to win versus playing not to lose thing is obviously, I mean, I'm sure you've heard it, used as the opposite way in a different context many times. But I find it really interesting in this way. I wonder if there's other ways to phrase it, because obviously the playing to not lose can be taken in so many different contexts, and people are familiar with it being about being too afraid to take the right risks. And so I think you're the way that you're talking about it is a much more like holistic approach, which makes the assumption that you're trying to achieve the perfect game, which is a really interesting sentiment. Moving forwards a little bit, you've spoken about sort of mentor figures and so on, and I mentioned Cooler. You had a reputation in the community that Cooler was like the player that you studied the most when you were sort of coming up. Is that how it worked? And is that advice you would give other people to just like study like one or two people?
Yeah, I'd say in my mind, let's see here. Biggest influences for me player wise were uh Cooler, Fatality, 04, CZM, and Lexer. And what I tried to take away from watching all of them is I felt that early on when I saw like early games of Fatality, I noticed that he always seemed to be ready with his crosshair placement. Like he was always ready to be in a fight, like to expect the unexpected, right? And I felt like that was a very good approach to take. And I think like because there are some players with playstyles, they like to play overly aggressive and they'll do things that catch you off guard. But if you make sure that you're ready for it, you can really punish players like that. Like their all-in gamble totally screws them over, and then you get full map control, and they kind of feed you the game in that sense if you're ready for it. It's only like if you just let it lapse in your mind that you're not ready for it, that's when they like can snowball the game from you. So I took that from Fatality, and then 04 to me, I felt like he read players the best and he played the player rather than the map, whereas Cooler did the opposite, and Cooler played the map and then played the player from there and tried to totally choke people out and constrict them and limit their options. And CZM was kind of like the aspect of how important timing was, which kind of goes along with Cooler, but in the sense of CZM did it even better. And Lexer, I think, was along the lines of 04, where in the style and sense of how he read the player and set up traps was very intelligent. He tried to play the player more so than the map most of the time. And I think what I tried to do out of all of those, though, the most I tried to apply Cooler's mindset of controlling the map and suffocating your opponent mixed with 04's player reading, and then entering my own flair into that and like melding all of that together. Because I think that sometimes what Cooler's greatest strength is can also be his biggest weakness, is that he has probably the best dodging out of any of the top duelers, bar none. That like the player ends up reading how he will dodge, and he takes much more damage than necessary, and then the grip on the map that he had. So I tried to look at that like, okay, how do I want to take Cooler's approach to the game, but make sure that I don't leave those kind of situations, for myself. Like I want to make the opponent be as pissed off at me as possible because I'm making good decisions over and over and over again. And so, yeah, I just tried to mix his game style in with 04's and focus my game a lot more around Rockets and LG, which are like more consistent and safe play than relying on rails a lot. And yeah, I definitely say I got that from watching those two.
And when it comes to, so would you say like it's the best thing to do for a player, like no matter the game, is to sort of, if they're trying to learn, is it to like try to model yourself, like try to pick somebody and like model yourself? Do you think this is like the best approach to improve quickly? Like, in studying, a few different top players as opposed to just one or 10, you gain enough of a contrast, but there's also enough like data to sort of work off of, or would you think is the best way to do it?
Yeah, I would say in any top game right now, like you want to look at a few top players that have different play styles, and you want to see what makes them so good, and can you personally actually apply it to your game. So an example is I kind of know the limits of my mechanics in game. There's no way that I can consistently rely on and apply, let's say, like toxic or strengths level LG to my game constantly and try to win all the fights, like most of my fights like that, right? But what I can learn from them is, okay, actually in these few situations, the reason they're aiming so well is the angles that they are taking, that they're setting up for predetermined fights that they know the person has to dodge this way or the other. And I'm like, all right, I can actually add this to my game, and if these situations come up, I can use these angles and these fights to my advantage. So you're looking to take what you can from the top players and apply it to yourself, but you're also looking to see if you could take things a step further. You're constantly looking for something like, wow, I actually think that I can do what they did, but I can do this a little bit better. I can add this to these scenarios, and I can actually come out with bigger advantages. Than they're like leaving things on the table that they don't realize that they are. And you try to find these little things that for yourself that you can apply to the game that makes you overall better. I think you should constantly be doing that. Like even I still do it today. Like I look at other players at the top and I like compare and contrast like my game to theirs. I'm never looking at it like, you know, I've won all these tournaments. I don't need to do this anymore. To me, that's bullshit, and that's leading to that's just leading to being upset by somebody. You know, I think
Right.
I should always like look at what other players have, and that there is going to be somebody that's better at something, and can I gain something from that?
Well, in that case, I mean, obviously that was, I would say, definitely a strength of yours because it seems like you, as you said at the beginning, you sort of naturally gravitated based on sort of the football influences towards
Mhm.
studying and so on and so forth. But like when you were a professional player, when you were winning tournaments and so on, often people say that consistency is the biggest and most troubling thing to achieve, and you already sort of spoke a little bit about how you sort of viewed like generally like I think if people can gather anything from all of the ways which you've described yourself and your approaches, I think with underneath all of that is it's all based on consistency. It feels like you have that in mind with everything. Is consistency like one of the biggest personal challenges you had to overcome, or were there other personal challenges that were very difficult when you're already a top level competitor?
Um, hmm. I'd say for a while there was a short period in like 2011, 2012 where there was like a patch change to the game, which made the game a bit faster and more aim dependent for a bit. Like certain playstyles and tempos on maps changed, and I probably lost a tournament or two to that. But over the time I realized it, and I started to see that I needed to improve like combat skills in certain areas and how to approach things, or like maybe I need to predict things farther ahead with aiming because the game is a little bit faster and people can move better. And so I think it comes down because I've tried to be the most consistent because I know that I have very good mechanics, but I don't have the best mechanics. Um, so I feel like in a sense, I have to work harder to win, if that makes sense. I get less opportunities to get, sick kills because I don't hit as much as other people. Like a good example is, and like when Evil started to get very, very good, like there are certain fights that he's winning that he shouldn't, he has no right to win, but he
Mm-hmm.
wins them anyway. And the same goes for like, you see Claws now in Quake Champions, that same thing is kind of happening. But so what you try to do is you try to just approach the game in as many times as you can. You create controlled scenarios that should work in your favor, and you do your best to avoid unnecessary damage and unnecessary fights. And just as certain things like have changed with games and like slight little things in meta on maps over the years, I'd just say like it's just adjusting to that, um and just not being too hard on myself if I end up like losing to a player who just he played his absolute best in that game and he deserved to win because like he played phenomenally, and just like taking it one step at a time.
So in that case, like looking back at all the tournaments you've played, when you're sort of at your top level, like should the reality have been that you would have won every single tournament, or do you think like the objective rational truth is that there is a degree of variance, which means that it's not possible to win all the tournaments? Because well, of course, in your mind, you're always thinking to yourself, I can win this. I'm going to win this game. I'm going to win this tournament. That's like how you have to think. So it's like that once again, that contradictory, rational view versus sort of the self delusion, which is there to help your performance. But have you come off of tournaments thinking I should have won this, I should have won this, I should have won this, or do you actually just sort of easily accept without too much in the way of negative emotions, and you're like, okay, you know what, I got second or I got third. I can't win every single tournament, but it's just about winning enough tournaments.
I go into every tournament trying to win. I've always felt that going into place top 4, top 8, or whatever is just shooting yourself in the foot. But I think what I've done best is when I have faltered, I've used that negative emotion that I feel and channel it into the next tournament and use it in what's the best way for me to prepare to win the next one. Like, what can I learn from my mistakes that I made that cost me the game, that I can avoid again. So every now and then I've had games where like I actually have played my best and I've lost. And so looking at that subjectively, I just need to be like, okay, you know, I did everything I could, and I'm playing, like I said before, I'm playing to not lose. I'm playing to be beat. Like if the player beats me, it's because he played amazingly. I'd rather be beat than take a loss, where a loss is in the sense of it's my own fault. I made and gave away too many situations and pretty much handed the win to the other guy, you know. Um, yeah, I think I like Sturmy a lot, but I remember there was some tournament I was at where he said something to me about, you know, like you can't expect to win like all the tournaments or something like that in that kind of sense. And I thought to myself, like, why can't I? I asked myself, like, why
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
I expect that? Like, why does that have to be a thing? Like, I don't want to go to the next tournament hoping I get top 4. I want to win. And I feel like everybody should have that mindset. That's just how I look at it. Like, you want to be playing at your best against somebody's best and you want to win. So I try not to like let that get into my mind of like just trying to achieve good enough. I always am reaching and going for the top, but I just do a good job of afterwards if I do lose, of just putting it into perspective that if there is another tournament opportunity, just use it as a learning experience instead, and just do what I can to get the victory at the next one.
Right. I mean, it's honestly very funny, the quote, just because it's like I could just see you turning around to Sturmy being like, "Why have you given up, man? Like, why have you given up? It's so fatalistic, and so on." But I'm moving in, away from the Quakelive era, where you achieved a lot of success in a game that's very highly skilled, in a game which has very limited amounts of variance from a game level. All the like pretty much all the variance comes from the player level, which is it has its pros and its cons. But you moved into Overwatch afterwards. And obviously, this is we were talking about a 1 versus 1 game mode. And actually, quickly, because you moved into Overwatch, do you think I've always felt like there's an enormous difference when it comes to taking and dealing with pressure, like team versus dual game. Like in a dual game, I feel enormous amounts of pressure. In a team game, I don't feel any pressure really to perform. So, like, quickly, like, what was the first things you noticed about trying to be professional in a team format?
Yeah, I've played team modes in Quake, and I tried to apply um, what strengths I have in that aspect to Overwatch, but I think even more, like I had to get even better at it. And what I've viewed in team modes is communication is so vital. Like the callouts that you make need to be very quick, concise, and give as much information as possible. So a good example to give, like, let's say for Dehang and I in 2v2, and I'll get back to Overwatch in a sec. So for 2v2 right now, like one call out we have is called danger. Literally, danger translates that, hey, there's a totem at this teleport exit, don't go. Like you're turning one word into all that valuable information, or you're constantly updating information so that people almost have like a visual wall hack of where opponents are, so they know, like, as we set up an attack on a scenario for Overwatch, let's say, right? So we're on offense, we're attacking, we know exactly where so and so is positioned. We call that out. We call, like, the ult chances, like what is it, ult management for their team, our team, and then instantly you kind of know as a team, like, okay, we need to take this space, we need to approach the fight in this manner, and just everything fluidly happens like that. And the better that your comms and the more valuable information that you're giving, the better. And I think that's something that with team modes is a big struggle for some people, is to filter out their negative emotions, or not even sometimes negative emotions, but random filter. And I think, like, Americans sometimes, I've noticed compared to Europeans, is sometimes they overtalk. Like they talk in sentences rather than quick, concise, few words. And I think that's something that Overwatch I really got a lot better at, moving from playing the flex role to shot caller. And I don't know, I just tried to apply the same way in duel with the team thing, is like just do everything that we can to control our own situations and to set ourselves up for success, and just keep learning from there.
I have to say, actually, I think I had this conversation recently with someone in CS. I forget who it was, but we were talking about how atrocious the average level of communication is in the pro scene in CS:GO, and not enough people are creating like communication protocols, which you just described, where because I always, when I was ever playing in Quake, I would always put it to a team like this. I would always say that, look, comms are for like in-game information. That does not include how you're feeling.
Yes,
right now.
exactly.
It's like it's there to provide data so that everyone in the team is the most informed as possible, and that's like one of the biggest intangibles as well. When you're like from a spectator point of view, it's very hard to analyze and effectively critique players. Like if you're sitting in the commentary booth or whatever it might be, when you don't actually know what information was communicated through them, through their teammates to them, and so on and so forth. So it's very hard to know where someone was coming from when they made a decision sometimes, but because you assume that they have all the good calls and the good information, but it's not always the case, and a lot of teams have very inefficient comms. So it's really cool that you mentioned that. And moving forward with the Overwatch discussion, were there any other big challenges, or did you find it as a Quaker very easy to adapt? Because one thing that we have seen is a lot of Quakers did go to Overwatch before Quake Champions, and none of them sort of like, everyone did kind of well in the beginning, but then it kind of fizzled out. Do you have any insights as to why those things happened?
I think part of it is because Overwatch relies so much more on the overall team play. You don't make as much of a difference individually, except for, let's say, and it depends on the meta, depending on like a certain champion that's playing. Like a lot of the burden of success can be on one person to succeed, and you're one or two people, and then you're like being supported by four others, if that makes sense, 4 or 5 others. And I feel like, so you could see like most of the Quake players in the beginning tried to play DPS type characters, but I think what kind of held Quake players back is I think Quake players are very, very good at predictive aim and positioning and setting up good situations, but we're not always the best at like critical aiming. So like getting the most out of headshots and things like that, because that's not really in Quake. That's not what Quake's about that super precise aiming. And I think that's where some of the other players from like CS and other games like have thrived in. And they were very, very good, because those were the roles that had the most impact on the game. If you're dealing the most damage in that aspect consistently, you can get the most kills for your team and snowball fights, right? So you're like the one person that can help win individually rather than based off of combining team ults and, outwinning, like outcompeting the other team based off of ult management. So I think near the end, where like you saw Cooler subbed for Misfits in a tournament and he was Lucio, myself moving from flex to shot caller at the Lucio position, and Dehang was flex support. I think for that was like the better spot for most Quake players, but most didn't want to play those roles because we're constantly in Quake, you're in control of everything. But I think those type of roles allow you to play so well positionally and help your team the most if you're playing consistent and communicating the best. So I think like playing like off tank and the lesser roles are actually better for Quake players, but it's just not as fun. And I think yeah, you could see like near the end, like we were playing very well for Liquid, and I think Cooler was doing well like at support, but he couldn't end up fighting a team after like the whole Misfits thing disbanded, and they went to like an all Swedish team, and Rogue went to the all French team and things like that. But yeah, I think that's kind of why it's like just raw mechanics for certain champions. There were other players that were better at that and more suited, and I think overall most Quake players are a little more selfish in their play than playing around the absolute team chemistry that you need in Overwatch to succeed. Yeah, so yeah, I got more stuff to add if you want. I don't know what your other question's going to be.
Oh no, go. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, and a big thing I noticed in Overwatch, and it's also applied to Quake Champions, with how fast and how necessary communication is. And a lot of players, it's hard for them to break from using push to talk. I'm sorry, but push to talk needs to go back to the dark ages. You need to be on voice activation. Like, everything that you say matters instantly. The instant you get communication out is the instant your teammates can process and help you. And something I've noticed a lot of players have a problem with, even in Quake still sometimes, is when they get into fights, they're quiet. And that's the same in Overwatch. Like, sometimes there's situations where people are so focused on the fighting that they don't communicate until the fight is over. But they don't realize that, if you just take the split second to help communicate what you're doing, that even though you're going to lose, let's say like 2 to 5% accuracy, and you might not kill the guy yourself, the information that you give your teammate can make up for that damage. So let's say it's like Soldier, for example. Let's say you're in a fight, and the fact that you communicate during the fight distracts you a little bit, and you miss like 2 to 3 bullets. So let's say you lose 30 to 40 damage. But the communication aspect that you gave allowed Genji to turn effectively and dive the target instead of doing his own thing, which he's off in his own world. He effectively made up for your damage for double. So he did 80 to 90, and you actually finished the target together rather than you focused on the target, and the damage that you would have done alone without communicating that wouldn't have finished him off anyway. And I think that's the biggest barrier of DPS players, is understanding the importance of communicating in the moment. No matter what, you should be giving relevant information. Even if it's just one word, just say what's important so that your teammates can help you. You need to work on playing together rather than trying to pull everything off yourself. If you pull things off by yourself, then that's just an added bonus. Just like how I approach like Duel, like trying to play most consistently, but if I pull off something hot, then that's great for me, but I'm not going to rely on it. You shouldn't rely on yourself like individually having to play lights out. Rely on your team.
It's actually quite amusing. I was just thinking about, because what you're saying about moving away from push talk to voice activation. I've wanted this for a while myself, because I also use push to talk, and I switched away from it because I found that it made communication very hard during fights. But obviously, one of the reasons why I think you see professional players, at least in CS, not using voice activation is because when you're at LAN, obviously you're on a stage or something, it's a noisy environment. You want to make sure that your mic doesn't get set off by random things in the background. And so I think that's why some people use push to talk. Do you have any sort of insights on that? Because I was thinking like, you could I don't know, like hook up a second keyboard, put it on the floor, have like a button for push to talk, you press it with your foot or something, like a
get some racing
pedal.
pedals.
Yeah. I mean, if you're doing anything, it sounds like it could work.
I would say for the most part, like the sound technology and where mics are going now, you can find and tune those levels to a good point where that shouldn't be too much of a problem. At least that's what I've noticed personally, like playing at tournaments and playing on stage where we need to communicate. I think that, it's just about players not being stubborn and stuck in that mindset, and just saying what you need to say. And it comes down to self-discipline too. Like we talked about, there are certain people who have a problem of communicating they're not giving necessary information. They start like verbally complaining and like venting, where like that's just something like over time you need to focus on and get out of the habit of doing. And you need to realize that the more that you do that, the more you're hurting your team, and that also hurts your chances of success. So I think it just comes down to people being more disciplined in their communication and what they're giving. If you want to vent and complain with your team, do it after everything is done. Don't do it in like the moment when everything matters. And
oh my god,
yeah,
that tilts me so much. I always tell people this as well. Like, you can't fix anything. If someone's making a mistake, you cannot fix it during the game. You're only going to make it worse. Just tell people to fix stuff, or like don't. In fact, I mean, if you want to be really good, like and you think your teammate's making a mistake, you can be like, after the game, be like, hey, I noticed something during the match. I wanted to go through it with you. And then, you pull up the VOD of the demo or whatever, you like jump in there and it's like you check it out and be like, yeah, I saw like this happened and I saw this, and just instead of like throwing out, and this like really branches into the idea of social intelligence and dealing with teammates, something that also is a really vital skill set, because you have to be able to, in this instance, like understand how to communicate to people so that they don't get immediately defensive, so that you can have a productive conversation. Is this sort of element of like social intelligence, moving into a more focused team environment with more people in Overwatch, obviously 6v6 instead of like a 4v4 format in Quake, was that something that you ever found challenging, like dealing with people in this way?
Yeah, I think in some aspects, yes, that is something that I've had to deal with, and I kind of try to get a feel for how people deal with that. And there's definitely some players where I try to like help amp them up in the game, or I try to help like, just keep them into perspective. Like, hey man, it's okay. The situation didn't work out, so I just keep your head up. What can we do next? Like how can we help you for this next fight? Just try to keep them in the game so they don't get down on themselves. And because I know like some people do mentally struggle with that, and some people don't need it. I think like a reason why DeHang and I work so well together is like, if we say something in the middle of the game that needs to be improved, it's about like whatever it is, it's about the main goal of winning. So whatever we can to like work on each other, like to fix in the game, like, okay, I need you to play at this position in this situation, or like the next time this comes up, I need you to do this or need you to do that. Like nobody takes offense to it. Like we're trying to, achieve the overall goal. And if we can improve how we're playing, that's what it should be all about. But I know like some people are a little more emotional and they feed off of like getting hyped up and things like that. So like for players like that, I'll try to approach it that way. And then, just over time, just try to get them to realize like, as they're playing with the team, like we've all got your back. Like if you make that mistake, that's why there's these other 3 to 5 players, depending on what game you're playing, like they're here to pick up the slack for you. Like there's other times where you're doing really well and somebody else makes a mistake and you made up for that. Like we're all here together. Just stay and don't get into the point of feeling down about yourself or your team. Just constantly work on improving and working as a unit.
All right, words of wisdom. I do want to blast through the remainder of stuff. I think we're near the end of the topics I wanted to go through for the podcast, so we can smash out the AMA afterwards. Yeah, you left Overwatch. What was the decision like there for you? Obviously, Quake Champions was on the horizon, but was that the only motivator?
It was a bit of Quake Champions was coming out. I wanted to. I thought a lot about this decision, and I just felt like I wanted to go back and to see if I could continue my legacy with a new Quake. It's not something that I had expected to come out when it came out, like the announcements and all that stuff. And to be honest, I was getting a little burnt out with Overwatch. I've been the player who I view quantity of practice over quality, and I felt like the amount of hours that I was having to spend in team practice, solo practice on like improving on your own stuff, then not only was it that, then I on my own time was going and VOD reviewing like other top teams or our own VODs, and then coming back with information, because like I was the shot caller for our team at the time. It just was getting to be a bit too much, I think, and just getting a little burnt out in the game. And just like with the opportunity that came up with Quake Champions, I felt like I could really go for something that I'd be proud about. And not that I wouldn't be about Overwatch, but I don't know, just it was coming back to my first love, if that makes sense, with Quake. And yeah, it just felt like the right decision, and I went for it. And I kind of looked at it like, I want Overwatch to have success with Overwatch League and things like that. And I look at it like, it's not like I hate Overwatch or anything, like Overwatch versus Quake. I like both games quite a bit. I just look at it like right now, I really love and enjoy playing Quake. And for Overwatch, I would actually like to come back to it in the future. Either be it by, I think I could bring a lot to the game in terms of a casting position as far as a color commentator, or potentially maybe being like a coach or assistant coach for a team and helping with individual mistakes and like how to properly approach and to improve players on the teams. I don't think that with the time that I've taken away from the game that I could kind of justify how much of a grind it would be to get back to that level to try to play again. I think my skill set would be better allocated and fit to do, the things that I mentioned.
Oh, very interesting. Maybe joining the ranks of talent in the future. Look forward to that if that's the case. But it does, like, did you ever consider also, going to any other titles? I mean, you said it would take a lot to get into shape in Overwatch. I know that there has been some other top players in Quake who tried their hands at CS. I think Cypher, notably, in Cooler. I'm not sure about Cooler actually, but I know Cypher was trying to get into CS:GO, and obviously, Fortnite's come out. It's not exactly how people would like how you'd maybe define an esport in some senses, but obviously there's a lot of money in it, and it's a game which I think it doesn't have, it's not as punishing as Quake is, but I feel like there are similarities in how it's kind of an arcade shooter and the kind of 1v1 dynamic in build battles, which is all about decision making and positioning. Like, so have you considered other games, or is it just Quake, Overwatch, and you're kind of settled with that at the moment?
I'd say Quake and Overwatch. I'm settled with it. And the only other thing though is like sometimes I do watch the other games. I don't really feel like I want to venture off and to compete in them, but I kind of live vicariously. And like, for example, I love fighting games, but I know I don't have the time and energy to put into it to try to get at that level. So I just appreciate what others bring to the table. Like, I'm only one man. I can only I can only allocate so much time, to one thing. So, but I still love watching, like fighting games. I love watching CS from time to time when I get a chance, and I'll probably do the same for Fortnite. Like, I haven't played Fortnite at all, but I've been watching it a little bit, and it's going to be interesting to see how it folds out over the course of this next year with what they're doing for the game. So yeah, like, because even though as much as I love to play and to compete and to be the best, I also love to appreciate. I also have a big appreciation for what others bring to the table, and I love in an aspect of being a spectator, and that's probably like how it'll stay that way, I think.
Okay, so to close out this podcast, what is your opinion currently of Quake Champions and its sort of esports formats, including your thoughts on Duel in comparison to Quakelive Duel? One of the sort of mini questions there would be, is it harder to be the best? Is there more variance than Quakelive? And finally, well, I guess you kind of answered sort of where you'll be in the future. So yeah, pretty much your thoughts on Quake Champions and the formats and Duel.
I'd say that comparison between Duel and Quake Champions and Quake Live is okay. So it's very difficult to just compare them one to the other because they actually are so different. The only thing that is the same is that it is 1v1. There are items and you want to kill the other guy, but it's like the way that you have to approach and achieve that goal is so much different, as well as like in Quake Live, you don't have to deal with champions. Like, everybody is the same. You have the same movement, same stack, same hitbox. So that's all static. Whereas metas and things shift in Quake Champions based off of champion balance. So there is always going to be that sort of variance where certain metas and certain patches, there will be certain players who excel more at certain things. And I think that you can see some variance in terms of placement with that. I think we've already seen that over the past year. But also, I think the biggest contrast is it's not Quake Champions Duel is not as fluid in terms of tempo and pace as Quake Live, because Quake Live is this smooth, consistent play of 10 minutes and an ebb and flow over that of control, whereas in Quake Champions, there's constant resets with the round system that they have in place, where, let's say like you get the 2 to 3 kills, you get control and you're making your comeback. Well, then all of a sudden, like, yeah, you won the round, but now it's reset. So you're both starting at an even plane rather than, you're constantly working to gain control and get the maximum value out of it over a longer period of time. Like, sometimes it's like a shorter burst of what you need to do, and sometimes I feel like that leads to one of two things. It leads to more passive play because you only have limited amount of lives per round, or it leads to big all-in situations because there's so few lives. So there's these two conflicting play styles that happen, and you don't normally meet in the middle. You don't have like a slow and fast like change up in pace of the game where you have with Quakelive. It's like polar opposites is what it's felt like so far for me in Quake Champions. And as well as in Quake Live, if you got like, let's say, not such a good favorable start, it's not the end of the world. You have more time to come back from it. But with the round system, when it does reset you, I feel sometimes like so much in the round actually does depend on the first spawn. And so like over the course of, let's say if it goes to 5 rounds, like, you know, the 3 rounds that he won got the more favorable spawn on that map, you know, with X champion compared to Y, like that can make a big difference sometimes. So I still think Quake Champions like Duel brings in a lot of skill, but I personally have enjoyed the standard, you know, like 10-minute rule set, and you're playing, you know, for like the time limit and then that sort of frag limit rather than the constant like round resetting, and you're adapting and changing mid game in that sense rather than from round to round.
Yeah, I definitely I feel the same way. I think for me, I'm definitely, maybe I'm just too conditioned by what I played for well over a decade. But
I think the positive thing about it though is like the Quake Champions duel system is better for newcomers and like mid-ranged players. It does give them a chance to like mentally reset and refocus and re-practice situations. But I think at the highest level, the time limit is the best overall format to see the most skill mentally and mechanically, like throughout the course of games. And I think you see less variant, like, yeah, you would see less variance in that aspect if it was the time limit compared to the potential of the round limit. But so yeah, I think it's better overall for competition, but I think more overall like fun factor and learning ability, I think it's better for the newer players for the round system. I don't know what your take is on that, but that's just how, from playing it and seeing other people play it, that's the take that I have on it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. As far as sort of thinking about how like other modes and methods that they could perhaps use, I think that's the topic for a different day. So I'll close out on that note. So thank you very much for joining me for this podcast, and off to the AMA.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Well, that's another episode in the books, and what an episode it was. It's always really good to hear from Rapha. He is fairly adept, I would say, at articulating his experiences and allowing people like us, the people that are not him, and not winning championships, to get an insight into exactly what it takes to be of that level. So it's really, really awesome to hear from him, and there's so many topics that we can go back and forth on. So definitely a guest that I want to have on in the future as well, and he seems very open to follow-ups. So yeah, as always, just going to use that as a moment to remind you guys, if you have ideas, you know, just throw them at me on Twitter, just at DDK Esports. Throw your ideas at me for guests, for topics. You know, if Rapha does come back again, what did you really miss from this conversation? What do you really want to hear in the next one? And that would be really helpful for me. It obviously is going to be the case that a lot of stuff, you know, I won't be able to do, or, you know, won't quite work out. Maybe I can't get the guest again, but, you know, maybe I can. You know, it's only helpful if you have any ideas. So thank you in advance for that. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. The next one, I'm unsure who it will be with just yet. I have still to nail down Sean and Jordan for follow-ups. Well, for Sean at least. For Jordan, nothing Gilbert. Our conversation will be surrounding performance specifically at the professional level. That is a topic I'm really interested in discussing with Jordan. We've talked about it off camera quite a lot, and off the mic quite a lot, so I know that it's going to be a good discussion. But that'll do it for today's podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in. Make sure that you subscribe and tell people about it if you think they'll enjoy it. And I'll see you on the next one.